Hello, so our first little demo for today is some fringe and some sparkle. I'm going to start, you can see I've sort of drawn in the stacks of fringe. I like to make sure that there's overlapping if we're looking up underneath them, that I've got notes to that to help me sort of source where I'm going to put my shadows. I'm going to go ahead and base in some skin tones on our figure here. So you can see from that kind of hoop of fringe as it kicks away around the waist, I like to see a bit of a cutaway, a bit of the other side of the fringe, helps me track that that's going to be a very shadowed area. We're still going to kind of do some base layering on this to help us build up some dimensionality. So you can kind of think of them as solid sheets of fringe, and then we're going to add the texture that separates them out. Bit of highlighting and toning to our skin so that we're not just like flat like a paper doll. We're also going to do kind of a sparkle choker collar of some big crystal things, just so we can see kind of what that looks like. The fringe that I'm looking at has a bit of a metallic sheen to it. It's a little bit stiffer, a little bit metallic, just so you know as we're working through it, it's kind of silver. So first things we're doing here is starting to add in some of those shadows, get a base coat in of a sort of a mottled gray with some highlights as it comes towards and some shadows in some other areas. And where we're going to put the crystal, I'm going to start by laying in very, very dark shadow lines where each of the crystals is going to go. So I've done little tiny dots kind of across the neckline in my deep dark navy blue. When we're doing fringe, just like when we're doing really any fabric, but especially in a fringe that's got segmented pieces like that, you're going to want to keep your brush moving consistently the direction of where you're going and allowing it to kind of trail off and make the texture as you're working. So don't worry about blending it too much. I'm also making sure to feather that shadow over those edges that we sketched in, so that no shadow has like a firm broken up edge. You can see that sort of in the mid-thigh region where there's like a shadow between the two levels of fringe, but it kind of goes up into the first level and comes down into the second. Basing in some hair shadows here, I'm using black and that navy blue as my base color and leaving a bright highlight along the side of the head while I wait on my underlayer of fringe to dry. You can see that we've already built quite an amount of texture into that base layer of fringe. There's a good amount of like heading into blue for the shadows. It comes into like grays. It doesn't get to bright white ever. And I'm working with it fairly watered down with a bit of medium in it so that I've got a bit of translucency as I'm layering these. So there you saw I took a little bit of white and did little tiny dots over each of the dark areas that we'd put into the brooch in the middle of the shirt, dress, and along the collar of the choker. So those little bright like highlights need to be the brightest thing on the page in order to seem super sparkly. And they need that bit of dark behind them in order to help throw that image, but also to help show like when you look at a diamond and it's faceted, there's like deep dark shadows in it, like looking at glass or metallics. In order to get that really, really bright highlight, we also have to have it darker. So I'm going to start piecing in some of my shadows, bumping them up. Still feathering my edges, still pulling down into that fringe shape. Now I've loaded my brush with white without any medium and no water. I'm doing pretty dry. And since this is a little bit of a metallic fringe, instead of making smooth lines for the fringes I'm adding in these highlights, I'm kind of letting my brush skip and hop along to show how it sort of reflects light in different widths and brightnesses as it catches. So it's almost like a little like stuttering, sometimes it's a dotted line, sometimes it's a stuttering line. But it's also allowing me to get like almost a 3D effect with the paint here. So it's a little bit like raised above the page because I'm using acrylic with no medium, with no water in it. I'm focusing on starting when I'm using this bright white on anywhere I'm going to get bright light on it. And then as it kind of peters off, I'm letting it trail into the areas that are overlapping a more shadowed section. Even in that shadowed section, we'd like to have some of this texture and this bright highlight, but we, want that first beautiful plop of bright white that we get when we have newly loaded brush to always be over our brightest areas. So you can see that especially in areas where we've got that shadow down, this texture really pops off the page. It gets a little bit more tone on tone as it hits the grays. That's why we do so much of that underpainting with the shadow and stuff. It just really helps sell the texture and the reflective quality of the fringe. Adding a couple of highlights in other places here and dampening highlights so that these can shine the brightest. So the ones in the hair I'm going to lower the value of so that the brightest highlights on the page are going to be the crystals along the neck and the fringe highlights. So here you can see we're starting to kind of move into a couple things you can use for details. It doesn't work as well on a canvas, but it works fairly well if you're working on top of paper and you've worked in some pretty thin layers. You can use a colored pencil to start kind of adding some softer highlights. It's never going to be as bright as the white paint, but it works very well to add a couple of soft things. You can also use a gel pen. So it's a white gel pen to make your little speckles a little brighter if you wanted. Now there's also the more illustrative technique, more Bob Mackie technique, where we do a little blob of white with paint, and then I like to use my pencil lead because it's really sharp to kind of blow that out to make that little star spangled. You can always add those in over a couple areas of the dress to help kind of sell that sparkly effect if you want to work in something that's a little more stylized. So here you can see that if we just did the bright white, it's nice and bright, but it doesn't seem quite as deep as shadowed. It doesn't catch the eye quite as much or feel as realistic as up around the collar where we've got those shadows underneath it. But if you need to add them after the fact, you can always add them in with a little bit of paint kind of watered down around them. It'll sink around the raised area of the white, or you can add them in with a marker around it. You can also use colored pencils to kind of soften and define some of the trailing edges of your shadows. Always an option. And of course, you can use your microns to do a little bit of detail, line work, things like that. Work on top of acrylic still. The microns do, Sharpies do. But I just used it to add some shadows underneath each of those little white dots on that cuff I've added on the wrist to help make it sit a little more in our world. Now I am taking my deep shadow color, that navy blue, and adding just a few more textured shadows. So we've been building, we kind of washed in shadows, and we built in textures, we moved towards light. I would like the shadows to feel more incorporated. So I'm using a little bit of that same shadow color and bumping up my contrast in a few areas and feathering it in. What's nice is because the white is really thick and it's already entirely dry. If the shadow goes over it, I can just kind of pat it on top since the white is raised, and I'll bring the white back to the light. So I hope that helps. That should give us kind of a nice starting guide for it, and good luck.